Hello. In today's video, I'm going to talk about Bernoulli's principle, at least as it applies to Venturi, and to sonic choke. Now, when you're first learning about porting, this tends to come up. It's in some of the books about porting. If you go online, then somebody is bound to bring it up. And I felt we needed to kind of talk about it a little bit. Now, the basic idea is that in a Venturi, you have a restricted area, and the air, as it starts from the entrance, will speed up going through the restricted area. So the air all starts coming through, and guys will tell you, well, you get the volume of the entrance and you get the airspeed in the center, okay? And that's kind of what they will do to explain it. And they will say, well, that allows you to increase the amount of air going through. And so that's their justification for taper when they add taper into a port. And they feel that increases the amount you get. Now, in a standard Venturi, we use Venturis in cars all the time. One of the prime examples would be a carburetor. We use this basic idea of this increased airspeed to draw fuel in on a carburetor to make a carburetor work. But in this case, I'm talking about rudder. You know, this would be the rudder, and this would be the valve area, okay? So we basically feel, because the minimum restriction point technically is supposed to be the valve. That's not always true. I mean, most of the time I find it to be the pinch point, which makes life a little more difficult. But it's supposed to be the valve. So we'll talk about the valve here. And then you have a diffusion area, which is after the valve, and put a valve there, and that is the cylinder. So they basically feel that you are going to get more air, especially if you add more taper, you are going to force more air through the valve area, which is the restriction, to get more air into the cylinder. And that seems kind of sensible. You know, it's like, well, yeah, I can see that. Because we know how Bernoulli's principle works, and it does say that with the kinetic energy of the air going through, the airspeed will increase with a restriction because the volume basically has to stay the same. So, why am I bringing this up? I mean, like I said, that's been taught before. It's in some of the books I've read. I mean, it comes from quite a ways back. I don't even quite remember when I first ran across it for porting. But I know it seems sensible, but it's wrong. And I know your first question is like, well, why is that wrong? Well, my first problem is airspeed at this point is a fixed number. Okay? What this relies on is you speeding up the air, okay, in order to increase the amount of air across the restriction. But we've talked about this in the airspeed video, is airspeed at peak, when you're all the way up here, the reason it peaks is because you hit maximum airspeed, which I suspect is very close to Mach 1. It's going to be in there somewhere, but I talk about it in the video because it's a little hard to calculate. But I show why your airspeed isn't like it is on the flow bench. So if we're at max airspeed here, and we have a fixed cross section, you are only going to move X amount of air. You can't increase the airspeed to move more air. So it really becomes about how much air can you move in the given cross-sectional area. And we've talked about this before. My basic number is 108 CFM per square inch. Okay? That's my basic number. Now, we've talked about it before. In certain circumstances, you might get a little better, but that's really probably a better number to be using. Okay? And so, if that is all this can pass, across the valve, if that's the throat area, across the whatever your minimal cross-sectional area is, then all you are doing out here is reducing the airspeed. So if we're at like Mach 1 here, I mean, you may be down at like, 360 feet per second. This is in a running engine, not on your flow bench. Say 360 feet per second. Okay, down here. So what is actually happening? What goes on when you, especially if you add more taper? I mean, if you were to really widen this out, what happens? If you make the engine have lots of taper. Well, we've talked about it. Taper basically raises the tuned length of the runner. And the reason is you have to get to a fixed airspeed. That's the airspeed at which it's going to peak at. So this is kind of set in stone. Your cross-sectional area, you already have the airspeed because all engines are going to peak at basically that Mach 1. And so, we're going to just call it Mach 1. Maybe just slightly below, I'm not real sure. But you have a fixed airspeed. You have a fixed cross-section. And that is where it's going to peak up here, okay? So you can't force more air through that by adding taper. But in a runner, it does affect what RPM that will be tuned for. Because the other variable about this is Bernoulli's principle really talks about a steady state, not a varying rate. And in the engine, not only do we have the valve opening and closing, but we have changes in RPM. And we've talked about this. I mean, remember CFM demand. As the demand goes up, as the RPM goes up, the demand goes up. So you start increasing the airflow until you reach that airspeed at your minimum restriction point, okay? And so this basic idea of adding taper to increase it doesn't work. All it does is slow the air down. Instead of, if it's closed up, maybe it's at 400 feet per second. You start opening it up at the entranceway now, maybe you're at 360. Now these are not real numbers. I don't have any way to actually plot the velocity inside of a running port. It's going to take somebody better than me to do that. I am basically just talking about the theory of how it works and trying to give you some numbers so you understand. Now, what happens if you reduce the airspeed at the beginning is it just moves, say this 360 to further down here. The more taper you add, the more distance it takes to get up to that initial speed in order to get you up to your Mach 1. And so you're basically effectively shortening the runner length by opening it up at the top. Now this can help you because if you're doing something that's more high RPM, then you need to shorten the runner length. And then we have the formula so you can kind of have an idea of what length you're actually looking at. But that will help tune it. Now, a prime example, if you have all of this well, let's say we do this differently, okay? And the runner is straight. Let's say our runner is much more straight, okay? Well, if it's long and you reach that Mach 1 and you're at an RPM below where you're kind of hoping the engine will peak, you know, the head may flow more, your CFM demand says it'll carry to, you know, a little over 5,000 RPM, and for some reason you're peaking at 45. And the reason I use those numbers is because, like I've brought up before, Nick's Garage has been running yet another 413 Chrysler motor with a long ram. He is now going on to video number 6 of trying to make this work because he thinks he can hit the 5,000 RPM. And when he runs it with a single plane, or maybe even a dual plane, but single carburetor, standard aluminum intake, shorter runner, it makes more power. But then he puts on the long ram, which has a very long runner, like 28 inches or something, and it keeps peaking at the same number and the same horsepower. Now, we've talked about this before. If you hit your max airspeed at a lower RPM, the motor can only ingest that amount of air at that RPM, even if your head flows more. If you hit your peak airspeed, the engine is done. And this is a prime example, because he's changed cams and he's done other things, changed exhaust, which turned out to be a disaster, but in order to try and get it to run, because he doesn't understand that his problem is he has reached his max airspeed. That's why they made a shorter ram, so that in certain engines it was tuned to a slightly higher RPM. And that's why way back in the day, ram tuning days, I mean, you're talking early 60s, the guys would used to cut the runner back in order to try and shorten it up to get it to RPM. And that's because they hit max airspeed. And like I said, his struggles are a very good example of how this is really the governing factor. Now, if you have a runner that's long and straight, what happens? Because we have air running through basically a tube, we'll call it. You know, I mean, the runner may be rectangular or trapezoidal or whatever, but we're talking kind of theory here, so we'll just call it a tube. So when you have this condition, what happens? Well, in the tube itself, on the cross section, if we were to have, whoops, sorry about that. If we were to have a cross section area, okay, and you've got air going through, okay, rushing through the tube. What happens is you start getting a boundary layer inside the tube, okay? Air will tend to kind of stick to a surface, and so it gets turbulent on that surface, and that creates a boundary layer inside of the port, the runner. And that boundary layer is why we say the air tends to run in the center. And if you were to look at it in the deal, what you'd actually see is a bit of a change in velocity to the point where you'd have slower velocity on the outside edge, you'd have your peak velocity in the center, and you'd have the slower again on the other edge, okay? So most of your air, and we know this as headquarters, runs in the center. And that's why even if you have a port, you can take your velocity probe and kind of look around and see where that high-speed center is actually located in the port to try and judge how it's doing about going into the port. You know, because it's not going to be dead center in the port. You are going around push rod walls, you're going over a short side radius, you got to get around the valve, so it's going to be biased towards somewhere. And you looking at that velocity can help you see where it's at. And your boundary layer is going to be a little more turbulent, and you can see how big that boundary layer is. Now, you can also hear it on the flow bench as you get it to run smoother because remember, your flow bench is only at like 320 feet per second. So it's not all the way up at its full speed. But you can start to hear it smooth out. You can see if you're actually using an old style manometer, which is what I started with, you can actually see, you know, if it's rough, it'll be bouncing because the air is not flowing through it well. So you're looking for smoothness. You're looking for a clean sound. You're looking for the air flowing nice. We are not necessarily looking for a number. Don't chase the little number because your cross-section area in this is what's going to cause it. Now, what happens in a tube? If it's real long, well, you can reach maximum velocity, you know, back here, if the tube's long enough. And it'll just kind of carry, if it's smooth, and if you look at a ram intake, it's pretty smooth and straight. It will carry that all the way through, and you will just peak at a lower RPM, because depending on your cross section, if this doesn't have taper, then you will hit whatever your airspeed is when you get to the RPM that has the flow for that cross-sectional area, okay? And adding taper, even to the beginning of this, if it's long, is not going to change anything. You know, it might help your entrance a little bit, because if you have too rough of an entrance, you could have a bigger boundary layer here, okay? Now, as airspeed goes up and up, this boundary layer starts to increase, okay? And that restricts the amount of area you have inside the runner. So if you actually have just a straight runner, okay, as the airspeed goes up, your volume that you can move will actually shrink down. They probably shouldn't have had a depressurization zone on that end. Okay? So as your airspeed goes up, your area inside the port gets smaller and smaller. So if we're talking about, again, our round port, okay? Well, that area can get very small, okay? To the point where basically the boundary layer takes it off and closes off its ability to flow because the airspeed is high and the friction is just so much. And that's why in a long length of a pipe, even if say you're moving water, you have a loss of pressure because it's having to force more through a restriction. It's using up the energy, okay? So you have to pay attention to that. And that's called sonic choke. Basically, the area of the port will constrict down and you can't move as much air. And that could be part of the reason it peaks at Mach 1. Air kind of changes at Mach 1. But in either way, you've got to remember that's kind of what's going on. Now, you can't really see some of this on the flow bench. Because you're at 320 feet per second, well, if you shorten the runner, if you add taper, you know, you add that, you know, heaven forbid, you add 7 degrees of taper to it, okay? You are shortening the runner, which means it has less restriction, which means it does better. Let's say this is the head, that's the cylinder, okay? This is the runner. You add a bunch of taper, if you put it on the float bench, it actually shows that it seems to do better. Because if you put that straight runner on a float bench, you seem to lose a lot of airflow. Well, you're not losing it as such, but you've got to remember the flow bench has a fixed amount of power that it is applying to a steady state condition. And so you start building up a boundary layer in a longer and longer runner, and the flow bench is going to show less and less flow because it really can only maintain that 320 feet per second, okay? And so it shows a drop in airflow. Now the engine's got a little more power on what it's doing, and it will behave a little bit differently on the engine than what you will see on the flow bench. And so you have to remember that when you're doing some of this. This is why you see a lot of guys adding taper, because they seem to feel, well, it really showed up better on the flow bench. Okay, that's fine, except for, like I've said before, the flow bench can lie to you. So if you go by this on the flow bench, you will be incorrect. It will not do well on the engine. You will not get the response out of it you are expecting to. You are essentially shortening the runner in the engine. Now, if the runner needs to be a little shorter for its tuned length, so you can get to the RPM you're trying to get to, then that will be a help. And a lot of times I will add in like a single plane intake where you have a long runner and a short runner. And I pointed this out on one of the ones for the Caddy that's really incorrect. The short runner should have virtually no taper, okay? Because most of the time, I'm not quite at enough length, at least for the RPM I'm working in, because I'm working down here a little bit. If you're working much higher, if you're at 9,000, it might need a little bit of taper to get the runner length correct. But the long runner in that kind of intake, it really needs some taper, because you want to try and equalize out the intake so that all the cylinders are kind of pulling together. Otherwise, you will have some that are tuned for a much lower RPM and are going to be kind of done, and others that are not. And sometimes this can even make the engine run poorly, but the first thing you'll really notice is it'll show a fuel distribution problem because it's pulling differently at each cylinder. And that really affects how the fuel is getting transferred from the plenum into the runners and what's happening in the runner, okay? So you need to be thinking about what it's doing and not fall into the trap that you can force more air through that restriction by adding taper. That's really not what's going to happen, because the airspeed is fixed, the cross-section is fixed, you can only move X amount of air. And I know this to be true. I can't calculate the exact airspeed, but I go back and I calculate what air made horsepower. How much air did I use in this engine to make horsepower? And I've shown that. And it tends to come out to this 108 CFM per square inch on most regular engines. Now, occasionally I get something that's a little higher. Now, the thing I have to be careful of is the one thing that will not show up in how I break it down is maybe if you have a little Helmholtz or inertia supercharging. If you have a little wave pattern going on, you can gain a little percentage, and then suddenly you're at 112, 114, you're heading maybe towards 120. Also, how straight it is really matters, because the 108, most of the engines I work in, you have a runner that's coming down, It doesn't necessarily have a good angle to the port and the head. It may be a bit obtuse or obtuse the other way. And you have to get around the pushrod wall and over the short side, which is normally pretty stout short side, because I'm working with heads that aren't necessarily raised runner, okay? So that's where the 108. You may, like I said, if you're going to figure out a number that's better than 108 for you, you need to crunch your very motor, the family, the type of head, and see what you're getting with a good known cross-sectional area so that you can figure out what it will actually be when you go to try and improve the port, okay? But that's Bernoulli's principle. Sonic choke does happen, and that may be why we tend to peak. I don't always think so, because I can carry past the peak pretty well sometimes. And if that was really all about just airspeed at sonic choke, then I wouldn't be able to carry it much further. It'd be just done because we hit the airspeed. Now, the only other thing I want to talk about is texture. Yeah, on this sonic choke, it's about the boundary layer, because as you speed up, this boundary layer in here gets thicker and thicker. Now, the texture on your wall will affect that. If you do a smooth texture, well, it'll actually do better on airflow and better on the flow path. Somebody's racing by. And so the problem is we are not just moving air. Unless you're doing a direct injection engine or something, we're moving fuel. And that really smooth texture will give you fuel problems. So you really can't do that. So we tend to run like a 60 grit texture on most stuff that we do. That tends to keep the fuel a little broken up. You don't wind up with a big boundary layer. Now, if you decide to do a burr finish, which is a rougher texture, this boundary layer is going to grow. And heaven forbid you do a dimple finish, this boundary layer is going to be huge. Okay? Essentially, you are shrinking the port size by increasing that boundary layer and causing it to choke down. And you don't always want to do that. Now, if you have a particular engine, maybe you have some big head and, big rectangular port head for like a big block, but you're trying to get it to run at a lot lower RPM, well, increasing the boundary layer might actually help you. But because it's going to shrink down the port. But in general, if you feel like that really improving it, either you have fuel problems and you're having to mix it better, the droplet size coming out of the carburetor is poor, something. Or the port, the runner, was too big to start with. You needed to shrink it down to increase that airspeed. That's the only way a rougher texture is ever going to help you. You're better off sticking with the 60 grit and just making sure things are sized right than you are trying to go to a burr finish. Now, sometimes something maybe on the floor of the plenum might help if you're getting fuel dropout on the carburetor, because you can use the boundary layer to mix it. But in the runner, you really got to think about what you're doing, because a lot of what we're taught really doesn't work the way they think it does. And I know this because I check what kind of flow I have. I check what kind of horsepower I made. I know where my horsepower is coming from. And this is one of the things that I've been trying to stress in this series, is know your horsepower. The better you understand what your compression is bringing, what your airflow is bringing, what your cross-section is at, the better you understand some of this and know where the power is, the easier it is for you to look at it and say, oh, well, I really got to fix this cross-sectional area real well. I either need a head with a offset rocker and move the pushrod wall over, or we need to go to a little bit of a raised runner and get a straighter shot. You start to see what needs to be changed for you to properly gain horsepower, so you're not chasing your tail, doing a whole bunch of changes, going, well, that didn't work. Well, this intake didn't change nothing. Or like poor Nick, I mean, he got talked into heat for the runner. Heat's always a bad idea. I don't even know why they thought it was a good idea. So he added heat to the intake to vaporize the fuel. That's not how it works. And of course, to do this, he went from headers to cast iron manifolds and promptly lost a bunch of horsepower because now the exhaust doesn't work. And so he has really been struggling strictly because he doesn't understand how this works. And it would save a bunch of that kind of work if you go watch the whole series. Like I said, I think he's about to go to video 6 on this. And if you understand how this works, you will not have the problems that he has kind of chasing it around in order to make it work. And that's why I brought up Bernoulli's principle. And like I said, I know a lot of porters preach this. I have been told this on message boards before. Well, you're not taking into account Bernoulli's principle. Well, it's not the way you think. This is a fixed deal. This is a fixed airspeed. This is a fixed cross-section. This is a fixed amount of air. All we can change is where it happens in the RPM band. We can't change the amount of air unless we increase the cross-section, because we can't change the airspeed. And that's why I keep saying you gotta pay attention to cross-section. You gotta pay attention to runner length. You know, we've talked about too long. You make this too short, you're not gonna get up to the airspeed at the RPM you're gonna be at, and it's gonna have trouble filling, especially if you're in a cam that's above 100% volumetric efficiency. It has to be right, or it's not going to work for you, and you're just going to have a problem child. Okay? So that's Bernoulli's principle. Hopefully that came across clear. I have struggled a little bit with how to present this, so if I didn't do well, we can do a part 2. Let me know in the comments. I have been enjoying quite a few of the comments. So I will catch up to you later, and that's how this goes, and hopefully you'll learn something that will help you build better engines. Wish you luck on all your projects, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.